and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We will hear a presentation, as Hila said, the 4 chapters, which I will then discuss briefly with the authors before opening the floor for a Q&A session. So without further ado, our first speaker is Franz Ebert, a research fellow at the ILO. Franz will present the chapter he co-authored with Francesca Francavilla and Lorenzo Guarcello, titled Tackling Forced Labor in Global Value Chains, What Role for Trade Instruments? Franz?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everybody.
Hi.
Let me see whether I can share my screen.
It is shared.
That's very good news. And you see the full screen, right?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much, Tamar, for the kind introduction, and of course to Hila and Tamar also for the invitation to this wonderful book launch event today. It's a great pleasure to present on this occasion our chapter, Tackling Forced Labor in Global Value Chains, What Role for Trade Instruments. And just for the record, I should note that from the outset that I'm speaking here today in a purely personal capacity rather than for the ILO. So as Tamar said, this chapter is really the result of a collaborative research effort with my colleagues, Francesca Francavilla and Lorenzo Guarcello. And what I would like to do in my, I guess now only 9 minutes, is to provide you with a quick snapshot in terms of what you may find in the chapter. Essentially, the chapter aims to do 3 things. First, to look at how forced labor concerns have been integrated into trade instruments. The second part then looks at what the literature says about the impact of trade instruments on forced labor. And the third part of the chapter eventually delves into the questions of what insights can we draw from the case of the Malaysian rubber glove sector, a specific case study, if you will. So let's dive right into the first part. This is, of course, very stylized, but what I would like to say here is that recently there has, of course, been a lot of talk on forced labor import bans. We know that the United States has had a forced labor import ban law in place for a long time, since the 1930s, and has adopted legislation and other measures in the last decade and beyond to increase the practical relevance of this law. So more import bans have been adopted under the relevant US law. The United States has also adopted 2 specific forced labor import ban laws, among which the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is the more widely known one, which essentially flipped the burden of proof for the relevant goods. And in addition, we have seen the adoption of new import bans by Canada and Mexico, in the case of Canada, actually also extending to child labor. And we have seen the adoption of the EU's forced labor product ban, which covers imported goods as well as goods produced within the EU for domestic sale or exportation, and which will become applicable as of late 2027. However, what the chapter would like to emphasize is that while import bans are, of course, a very important aspect for the debate regarding modern slavery in supply chains, in global value chains, the way in which trade instruments or trade policy have engaged with forced labor is considerably broader. Here we could mention, for example, the unilateral trade preference schemes, such as the use or the previous US GSP, some of which have linked tariff benefits to labor rights issues, including forced labor. And we have several cases from the past where trade benefits under these schemes were withdrawn as a direct response to forced labor issues, for example, in Myanmar in the late 90s in the case of the EU arrangement. In addition, trade agreements between 2 or more parties have increasingly included commitments regarding the abolition or combating of forced labor, and the chapter goes into the huge variety of implementation mechanisms in this regard that may or may not involve sanction-based dispute settlement, in addition to others such as technical cooperation, and stakeholder engagement, among others. It may also be interesting to note the increasing interactions between different trade instruments, specifically on the point of forced labor. For example, the Canadian and Mexican forced labor bans had been adopted in line with and following the adoption of a specific legal obligation under the US Canada-Mexico trade agreement requiring the prohibition of such imports. And similar obligations to adopt the import ban on forced labor produced goods at the domestic level have also been included into several other recent trade agreements, especially those concluded by the US, but there's also one agreement recently concluded by Canada that includes a similar legal requirement. So all these developments then, of course, beg the question of what this means for labor rights in practice. And what we did in the second part of the chapter was then to have a look at the available literature on the practical effects and in particular on labor-related trade sanctions. So under trade agreements, there has been relatively little action in this regard. So that section focuses primarily on unilateral trade instruments. And the empirical literature tells us a rather cautionary tale in this regard, suggesting that the effects of such trade sanctions in terms of addressing forced labor have been rather limited and are above all highly case-specific, depending on various contextual factors. I don't want to say too much here because you can find the more detailed analysis in the chapter. So I leave it as a little teaser. But for forced labor bans specifically, I will say that even though the literature here is surprisingly sparse, we also see a broad variety of findings and again, a very strong dependence of contextual factors. And we really have a gap of or lack of literature that could provide us a better understanding of the relevant patterns in this regard. Something that I thought was worthwhile highlighting as well is an insight by Kevin Colburn, who has done extensive research on trade instruments, labor issues, and global supply chains. And that was that trade instruments, according to his findings, are likely to be most effective in the long term when they both harness and strengthen the regulatory capacity of other relevant actors, especially the state. And to this end, it is important, and that has been highlighted by other scholars in broader contexts as well, it is important to understand these instruments in relation to other regulatory layers and, of course, the local context. And that brings us then a little bit to the third part of the chapter, because what we then tried to do, in a way, was in that third part to zoom into one case study and try to understand how these instruments, in this case the import bans, have played out in practice and how they interacted with other relevant frameworks for addressing forced labor, including at the domestic level. So what happened in the case of the Malaysian rubber glove industry? As you probably know, they are a world leader in rubber glove production. This production is mainly migrant-based, and there has been evidence and reports of several indicators of forced labor, including debt bondage, withheld wages, and several others. So what, as of 2019, then happened was that several import bans in the US specific customs law terminology they refer to as withhold release orders. Several of these orders were adopted. And initially, that triggered, especially after the first case, the first ban, that triggered relatively limited concerns within the industry. However, that changed when more of these withhold release orders, more of these import bans were adopted, including against the world leader Top Glove in the midst of the pandemic. And that coincided with aligned action. And here we have again these interactions between different supply chain governance instruments, if you will, and other economic governance instruments that coincided with aligned actions, for example, the canceling of certain procurement contracts with relevant firms by the government of Canada, and also some action taken by the Norway's government pension fund Global. In result, and that is arguably specifically or in particular due to the import bans, though, we saw as an effect the estimated cumulative loss in revenue from rubber glove exports of about $800 million US. And more importantly, perhaps, that also impacted increasingly buyers' confidence into Malaysia as a supplier. In response to this, and that's something that we're getting quite strongly from the literature and also the documentary research that we've carried out, companies took a number of different measures that included reimbursing recruitment fees, in one case in total up to $30 million US. It's a number of structural changes in human resources policies, improvement of housing conditions, increasing of wages, among others. We also have evidence that this has spurred on certain private governance initiatives at the local level, including the Responsible Glove Alliance, that is an industry-wide initiative committing its members to specific due diligence and transparency requirements. And it arguably also provided a stimulus for national level policymaking. And we find again more information on this in the chapter. However, what we also find is that interactions with the actors or other actors in general has been relatively limited. So what we see is a very strong reliance of US customs authorities on private auditors, and hence also the companies affected by the bans. We see less of an engagement with local state institutions, and we also see less of an engagement with the relevant civil society actors in the remedial phase. And I'm happy to say more about this in the Q&A if of interest. What we also see is that there has been, at least in one case, evidence of negative effects of the import ban in question on workers in one case. That was a case actually before the pandemic. And here what we saw is that the employment of workers was terminated due to the economic impact on the company. And according to a US report, actually a US government report, that then also reinforced the vulnerabilities of the migrant workers concerned, which found themselves in an even more difficult situation than before. By way of conclusion, because I understand that I really need to wrap this up before the moderator intervenes, I'd just like to highlight a couple of key takeaways for us as authors, but we hope we also express them adequately in the chapter. And that is that, of course, a variety of approaches to forced labor import bans and other trade instruments exist, with a lot of differences as to their practical effects. In some cases, we find that import bans especially have proven helpful to support the remediation of forced labor instances. However, I have pointed out a number of limitations, of course, and I would also like to point out that our case study is the rubber glove sector in Malaysia is usually really referred to as almost like a best practice case, the case where a lot of action has happened. And even in this case, we find quite a number of limitations, as we've said before. So that is very important. And that's also why we come to the conclusion and would like to highlight that these trade instruments, including forced labor import bans, are on their own unlikely to be able to address the root causes of forced labor and need to be applied in complementarity with other measures, especially also at the domestic level, of course. And importantly, import bans especially, but not only, we also have such evidence for other trade instruments, can entail unintended effects for both workers and companies. So there is a need for reflecting on accompanying measures, potentially such as impact assessments, to make sure that these instruments don't do more damage than they help. And perhaps to make the linkage also to the other chapters in the book, we also did have the impression that aligning import bans and other trade instruments with other supply chain governance instruments will be a continuous challenge and one of the many research issues that would need to be addressed to understand the issue further. With this, I would like to thank again the editors, of course, Tamar, for her patience as a moderator, and I look very much forward to the debate. Thank you.